I knew my family was broken, but I never imagined it would start unraveling at 2 o'clock in the morning. The knocking wasn't loud, just persistent, like someone who didn't want to wake the neighbors but didn't have the strength to knock any harder. I was half asleep in my small ranch-style house in Ohio, the digital clock on my nightstand glowing 2:03 a.m., when I heard it again, 3 soft thuds against my front door. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it. At 67, living alone after my husband passed 3 winters ago, you learn to question the sounds in the dark. The furnace clicks on. The pipes settle. The wind presses branches against the siding. But this was different. This was deliberate. I slipped my robe over my shoulders and walked down the hallway, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floors. The porch light spilled a pale yellow glow through the frosted glass. When I opened the door, Margaret, my older sister, Maggie, was standing there, or at least trying to. Her gray coat hung loosely from her shoulders, her hair unbrushed, her breathing shallow and uneven. Before I could say her name, she swayed forward. I caught her by instinct, her weight lighter than I remembered, her body trembling like she had walked miles in the January cold. "Maggie?" I whispered, easing her down onto the entryway rug. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. She tried to speak, but the words didn't come. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I assumed it was the 911 dispatcher because my thumb had already hovered over the emergency call button the moment I saw her face, but it wasn't. It was a text message. From our mother. Dorothy Harper. 92 years old and still somehow in control of everyone around her. The message was short. Don't help her. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. The words didn't even surprise me. They settled over me like something familiar, something I had felt my whole life without ever naming it. Don't help her. As if Maggie were a stray animal scratching at the door. As if she weren't her own daughter. I looked down at my sister, her hand clutching the sleeve of my robe like she was afraid I might disappear, and something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. I pressed 911 and held the phone to my ear. My voice was steady when I gave the operator my address. I remember thinking how strange that was. Steady. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights flashing silently against the sleeping houses on my street. They worked efficiently, asking calm questions, checking her pulse, helping her onto a stretcher. I followed the ambulance in my 10-year-old sedan, the heater blasting against the 20-degree air, my mother's text message still glowing in my mind. At the hospital, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I watched nurses move around my sister with quiet urgency. They asked me about medications, about medical history, about living arrangements. "She lives with your mother," one nurse asked gently. I nodded. Maggie had lived there for years, ever since her divorce. "And your mother didn't call for help?" I hesitated. I thought about the text. I thought about the way Maggie had shown up at my door instead. "No," I said finally. "She didn't." Sitting in that plastic chair in the waiting room, listening to the hum of vending machines and distant footsteps, I realized that the knock on my door hadn't just been about that night. It had been about decades. About quiet control. About guilt disguised as duty. About the way one daughter leaves and the other stays, and somehow the one who stays ends up with nothing. I didn't know the full story yet. I didn't know what Maggie had been living through inside that house. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: if I had listened to that text message, if I had closed the door, I would have been repeating a pattern that had shaped our family for as long as I could remember. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to do that. Margaret did not wake up until late the next morning, long after the sun had risen over the hospital parking lot and turned the frost on the windshields into thin streams of water. I had not slept. I had sat in that molded plastic chair with a paper cup of stale coffee cooling in my hands, replaying every small detail from the night before. The way she had leaned against my door. The way her coat had slipped from her shoulder because it no longer fit her frame. The way our mother's message had arrived. Not with concern, but with instruction. Do not help her. Around 8:30, a young doctor with tired eyes and a calm voice approached me. He explained that Margaret was dehydrated and severely undernourished. He asked gentle questions about her diet, her medications, and her daily routine. I answered what I could, which was very little. I had not been inside our mother's house in almost a year. Has she been seeing her primary care physician regularly? He asked. I hesitated. Margaret had always handled her own appointments. At least, that was what I believed. She lives with our mother, I said carefully. Our mother usually manages the mail and the bills. The doctor nodded in a way that told me he understood more than I was saying. We are going to run a few more tests, he said. But she should recover physically with proper care. Physically. The word stayed with me. When I was finally allowed into her room, Margaret looked smaller than she had ever looked in our childhood photographs. Her silver hair lay flat against the hospital pillow, and her eyes, though open now, carried a quiet exhaustion that I had never seen before. She tried to smile when she saw me. It did not quite reach her eyes. You did not have to call, she whispered. Her voice was thin, like paper rubbed too many times. I pulled a chair close to her bed. Yes, I did, I said softly. She glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone else to walk in. Did Mom text you? She asked. I nodded. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She gets upset when I cause trouble, she said. Cause trouble. The phrase landed heavily between us. I thought about all the years Margaret had stayed in that house after her divorce, moving back into her old bedroom at age 52 because our mother insisted it would be temporary. I thought about the birthdays I had invited her to, the holidays she declined because Mom did not feel up to traveling. I thought about how I had accepted those explanations without looking any closer. Maggie, I said carefully, when was the last time you saw your own bank statement? Her eyes opened slowly. There was confusion there, and something else. Embarrassment. Mom handles the finances, she said. It is easier that way. She has always been good. With money. That was true. Dorothy Harper had always been good with money. She had stretched my father's factory salary through 3 decades, clipped coupons with precision, balanced the checkbook down to the penny. But good with money was not the same thing as generous with control. Do you have access to your account? I asked gently. Margaret looked away. The heart monitor beside her bed beeped in a steady rhythm. I do not really need it, she said. Mom transfers what I need. Transfers what I need. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Margaret had worked for 30 years as a dental hygienist. She had contributed to a retirement plan. She had savings. At least she had, the last time we spoke about it. When was the last time you bought something for yourself? I asked. She did not answer. Instead, she stared at the thin hospital blanket covering her legs, as if trying to remember a detail from long ago. Later that afternoon, a social worker stopped by the room. She asked practical questions about living arrangements and support systems. When Margaret mentioned returning home with our mother, the woman's pen paused slightly above her clipboard. Is that where you feel safest? She asked. Margaret hesitated just long enough for me to notice. I thought about the text message again. Do not help her. I thought about the quiet way my sister had appeared at my door instead of calling an ambulance from her own house. I thought about the weight of her body in my arms, lighter than it should have been. She can stay with me, I said before Margaret could answer. My sister turned toward me, startled. Just until you are stronger, I added. The social worker gave a small nod. Margaret's eyes filled, not with tears exactly, but with something close to relief. For the first time since the night before, I understood that the knock on my door had not been an accident. It had been a choice. And choices, even quiet ones made at 2 in the morning, have a way of exposing truths that daylight can no longer ignore. Margaret was discharged 3 days later with a stack of instructions, 2 new prescriptions, and a follow-up appointment scheduled with a primary care physician across town. I drove her home to my house instead of our mother's, and neither of us said the word home out loud. The January sky was a pale gray sheet stretched low over the highway, and the heater in my car hummed steadily against the cold. She watched the passing fields in silence, her hands folded neatly in her lap like a guest who was not sure how long she was allowed to stay. When we pulled into my driveway, she hesitated before opening the door. "Mom is not going to like this," she said quietly. I turned off the engine and looked at her. "Mom does not have to like it," I replied. "You need to get stronger." Inside, I set her up in the spare bedroom that I used to call Daniel's office before he passed away. The quilt on the bed was clean, the curtains freshly washed, the room simple but warm. Margaret ran her fingers over the wooden dresser as if she were testing whether it was real. "It has been a long time since I stayed anywhere else," she said. That sentence lingered in the air. A long time. Not a weekend. Not a month. Years. That afternoon, while she rested, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and logged into my own bank account just to steady myself with something familiar. Numbers that made sense. Transfers I could trace. Bills I could see. I thought about the question I had asked her in the hospital. "When was the last time you saw your own statement?" Around 4 in the afternoon, her phone rang. She flinched at the sound. The name Dorothy flashed across the screen. Margaret looked at me before answering, as if asking permission without saying so. I nodded once. She put the phone to her ear. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. I could not hear the other side of the conversation, but I could see it in her face. The tightening around her mouth. The way her shoulders curved inward. "I am fine," she said. "Evelyn just wanted me to rest here for a few days." A pause. Her eyes flicked toward me again. No, she did not overreact. I was tired. Another pause, longer this time. "I will come back when I am better." When she ended the call, she did not look angry. She looked smaller. She said I embarrassed her, Margaret told me. The neighbors saw the ambulance. I felt a quiet heat rise in my chest. Not explosive. Not loud. Just steady. "You were ill," I said. "That is not an embarrassment." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table across from me. "She worries about appearances," she explained, as if defending something sacred. I studied her carefully. "Maggie, do you have your debit card with you?" She blinked. "Mom keeps it in her desk. So it does not get lost." "And your identification?" She hesitated again. "Also in her desk. It is safer there." Safer. The word echoed. Told her I needed to pick up a few things from the grocery store, and she nodded, still moving carefully as she regained her strength. The sky was clear but sharp with cold, the kind of January morning where the air feels like glass against your lungs. As I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, nothing looked unusual. The same trimmed hedges. The same white colonial house with dark green shutters. The same flag hanging neatly by the garage. From the outside, Dorothy Harper's home looked orderly, dependable, almost admirable. It always had. I parked along the curb instead of in the driveway. For a moment I sat behind the steering wheel and studied the windows. No movement. No sign that anything had shifted since Margaret left in the ambulance. I walked up the brick path and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed faintly inside. A few seconds later, the door opened just wide enough for my mother's face to appear. Her silver hair was perfectly set, her cardigan buttoned all the way up despite the heat inside the house. "Evelyn," she said evenly. Not surprised. Not welcoming. Just acknowledging. Where is your sister? I asked. Where she belongs, she replied. At home. She is dramatic, but she will settle down. I held her gaze. She is not coming back. For a brief second, something flickered behind her eyes. Not worry. Calculation. You have always interfered, she said calmly. You left. She stayed. That was the arrangement. Arrangement. I felt the word settle heavily in my chest. What arrangement? I asked. She opened the door wider but did not invite me in. I stepped across the threshold anyway. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something older beneath it. Everything was in its place. The family photographs along the hallway were arranged in precise order. My high school graduation picture. Margaret's wedding portrait. My father standing stiffly beside Dorothy on their 30th anniversary. Margaret is not strong with details, my mother continued, walking slowly toward her desk in the living room. She forgets things. She misplaces money. I keep it organized for her. She opened the top drawer of the desk and removed a stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band. Bank statements. Retirement account summaries. I recognized Margaret's name printed across the top. You see, my mother said. I manage everything. It is easier. I reached for the papers, but she held them just out of reach. How much access does she have? I asked. She does not need access, Dorothy replied. She has me. There it was again. The quiet certainty. The belief that care and control were the same thing. I glanced around the room and noticed something I had overlooked before. Margaret's coat was hanging by the back door. Her shoes were neatly lined beneath the bench. But there were no personal touches. No framed photos that belonged solely to her. No small decorations that reflected her taste. It was as if she existed in the house without ever claiming space inside it. Where is her debit card? I asked. In my desk, my mother said simply. She loses things. And her identification? Also here. I exhaled slowly. Mom, she is 70 years old. She is not a child. Dorothy closed the drawer carefully. You do not understand, she said, her tone tightening for the first time. She would fall apart without me. I thought about the hospital room. About the way Margaret had flinched when her phone rang. About the way she asked if I should have called for help. She almost did fall apart, I said quietly. And you told me not to help her. My mother's expression did not change. I was handling it, she replied. You always overreact. The room felt smaller than I remembered. The air heavier. I realized then that this was not about a single night. It was about years of slow decisions made in quiet rooms, justified as protection. I stepped closer to the desk. I need copies of those statements, I said. Dorothy's jaw tightened. That is none of your concern. It is now, I replied. We stood there in silence, two women who shared the same last name and almost nothing else in that moment. I could see that she still believed she was right. That she had built a system that worked for her, and that any disruption was a threat. As I walked toward the door, I understood something with painful clarity. Margaret had not just needed medical attention. She had needed permission to leave. And permission was the one thing our mother had never willingly given. When I returned home that afternoon, Margaret was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of tea cradled between her hands. The late winter sunlight filtered through the blinds and cast thin stripes across the floor. She looked up as I walked in, studying my face carefully, as if she could read what had happened without me saying a word. You went there, she said quietly. It was not a question. I set my purse down on the counter and nodded once. I needed to see for myself. She lowered her eyes to the table. She does not like when people question her. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Maggie, I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you know how much money is in your retirement account right now? She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the mug. The last time I checked was a few years ago, she said. It was enough. I remember feeling relieved. Do you have online access? I asked. She shook her head. Mom said it was safer if she handled it. She said the passwords were complicated. I reached across the table and took her hand gently. We are going to call the bank together. The next morning we drove to the local branch where Margaret had opened her account decades earlier. The building had been renovated since then, but the name on the sign was the same. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and paper. A young woman in a navy blazer greeted us with a professional smile and asked how she could help. Margaret explained that she needed to review her account details and update her contact information. The woman asked for identification. Margaret looked at me, her expression tightening for just a second. My identification is at my mother's house, she said softly. I stepped in and explained the situation calmly, without accusation. The banker listened carefully and then suggested alternative verification methods. It took time. Security questions. Old addresses. The name of Margaret's first employer. When the account finally appeared on the screen in front of us, the room felt strangely quiet. I watched Margaret's face as the numbers came into view. Her expression did not change at first. Then her brow furrowed slightly. That cannot be right, she murmured. The balance was a fraction of what she had once described to me. Withdrawals over the past 3 years were listed in neat columns. Transfers. Checks. Electronic payments. Each transaction looked ordinary on its own. Together, they told a different story. Do you recognize these? The banker asked gently. Margaret leaned closer to the screen. She shook her head slowly. No. I did not authorize that. I felt a familiar steadiness settle inside me. Not anger. Not panic. Clarity. Who is listed as an authorized user on this account? I asked. The banker clicked through another tab. Dorothy Harper, she read aloud. Margaret inhaled sharply. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, like the sound of something fragile being set down too hard. She said she was helping, Margaret whispered. I placed my hand over hers again. Helping does not mean removing your choices, I said softly. The banker explained the options available to us. Changing passwords. Removing authorized access. Requesting copies of transaction records. Filing a report if necessary. Each step sounded clinical, procedural, almost simple. But I could see that for Margaret, it was anything but simple. It was the unraveling of a belief she had carried for years. That dependence was the same as safety. That obedience was the same as love. When we left the bank, the wind had picked up, sending dry leaves skittering across the parking lot. Margaret stood beside my car for a moment before getting in. I thought she was protecting me, she said. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not weakness but exhaustion from carrying a story that no longer fit. You were protecting her, I replied quietly. And for the first time since she had arrived at my door in the middle of the night, I saw something shift in her posture. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just enough to suggest that she was beginning to understand the difference. The silence in my house felt different after the bank visit. It was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was sharp with awareness. Margaret moved more slowly that evening, not because she was weak, but because she was thinking. I could see it in the way she paused before speaking, in the way her eyes lingered on ordinary objects as if they were newly unfamiliar. After dinner, she sat across from me at the kitchen table while I spread the printed transaction records between us. The numbers did not shout. They did not accuse. They simply existed, quiet and undeniable. She always told me we were stretching things. Margaret said softly. She said utilities were higher. Property taxes were rising. She said I should be grateful she knew how to manage it. I traced one of the larger withdrawals with my finger. Did you ever sign documents? I asked. She nodded slowly. Sometimes. She would bring papers to the table and say they were routine. I trusted her. The word trusted lingered in the air like something fragile. I did not correct her. Trust had not been foolish. It had been human. The next morning, I called an elder financial protection hotline recommended by the bank manager. My voice was steady as I explained the situation. I did not dramatize. I did not accuse. I described dates, amounts, authorized access. The woman on the line listened carefully and explained that what we were describing could qualify as financial exploitation, even within families. Hearing those words spoken by someone outside our household shifted something inside me. It was no longer just a family disagreement. It was a pattern with a name. When I hung up, Margaret was standing in the doorway. "Are you reporting her?" she asked quietly. I turned toward her. "I am asking questions," I replied. "There is a difference." She folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, but protectively. "She will say I agreed to everything." "Did you?" I asked gently. Margaret hesitated. "I agreed to let her handle things," she said. "I did not agree to disappear." That sentence settled between us with more weight than any number on the page. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. "Dorothy." I answered. "You have been meddling," she said without greeting. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "The bank called to confirm changes." "Margaret is updating her information," I replied evenly. "She is allowed to do that." There was a pause on the line. "You are confusing her," my mother said. "She does not understand finances." I looked across the room at Margaret, who was reading through her own statements again, this time with a pen in her hand. "She understands more than you think," I said quietly. Dorothy exhaled sharply. "After everything I have done for her. After everything she has given up," I answered. The line went silent for a moment. Then my mother spoke again, her tone cooler. "If you pursue this, you will tear this family apart." I felt a familiar pressure behind my ribs. The old reflex to smooth things over. To reassure. To compromise. Instead, I let the silence stretch. "Maybe it has already been torn," I said finally. When I ended the call, my hands were steady. Margaret looked at me, searching my face. "She is angry," I said simply. Margaret nodded once. "She has always believed anger makes people retreat." I sat down beside her and placed my hand over the papers again. "Not this time," I said. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree in my yard. The house felt warmer than it had in years, not because the temperature had changed, but because something unspoken was finally being acknowledged. Margaret straightened her back slightly as she reviewed another line of transactions. It was a small movement, almost invisible. But I recognized it. It was the posture of someone reclaiming space inch by inch. And I understood that what began as a knock in the middle of the night had become something far larger. It was no longer about rescue. It was about recognition. And once recognition takes hold, it does not easily fade. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelope was thick, the return address typed neatly in the upper left corner. Dorothy Harper. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment before opening it. Margaret was in the living room, folding laundry slowly, concentrating on each towel as if precision could steady her thoughts. I slid a finger beneath the flap and unfolded the papers inside. It was a formal notice from an attorney. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Just precise. It stated that my mother was concerned about Margaret's temporary relocation and requested immediate clarification regarding access to shared financial resources and personal property. Shared. The word was underlined. I carried the letter into the living room and handed it to Margaret. She read it carefully, her lips moving slightly over certain phrases. When she finished, she did not look surprised. She has always prepared for resistance, she said quietly. Even when no one was resisting. I sat down across from her. Did you ever sign a power of attorney? I asked. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, searching her memory. Yes, she said at last. After my divorce. She said it would help with paperwork while I was overwhelmed. Did you revoke it? I asked. She shook her head slowly. The room felt still. I understood then that this was not simply about bank withdrawals. It was about legal authority quietly transferred during a vulnerable moment. We need to review everything you signed, I said gently. That afternoon we scheduled an appointment with a local attorney who specialized in elder law. His office was modest, with framed certificates on the wall and a pot of coffee brewing in the corner. He listened carefully as Margaret explained the timeline. The move back home. The signed documents. The gradual shift of responsibility. When he finished reviewing the copies we brought from the bank, he folded his hands on the desk. You may have granted broad authority, he said calmly. But authority does not eliminate accountability. Margaret exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding that breath for years. Can I revoke it? She asked. Yes, he replied. If you are competent and willing, you absolutely can. I watched her posture change slightly at that word. Willing. No one had asked her that in a long time. On the drive home, she stared out the passenger window at the rows of houses passing by. I thought staying meant loyalty, she said quietly. I thought leaving meant betrayal. I kept my eyes on the road. Sometimes staying is just fear wearing the costume of loyalty, I replied. She did not argue. That evening, she sat at my dining room table and signed new documents. Her signature was steady. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Each stroke of the pen felt like a quiet correction. We mailed certified copies to the bank and to my mother's attorney the next morning. The response came quickly. A voicemail. Dorothy's voice, cool and composed. You are making a mistake, she said. You do not understand the consequences. I listened to the message twice before deleting it. For most of my life, consequences had meant raised eyebrows, long silences, subtle withdrawal of approval. But now the word felt hollow. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen counter, reviewing her new account login information. She looked up at me. She will not forgive this, she said. I poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. This is not about forgiveness, I said quietly. It is about freedom. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The oak branches moved gently in the breeze. Inside, the house felt steady. Not because the conflict had ended, but because something fundamental had shifted. Margaret had not just stepped out of our mother's house. She had stepped out of a structure built on quiet permission. And once that permission was withdrawn, the structure could not stand the same way again. The formal response from my mother's attorney arrived the following week, written in language that sounded calm but carried sharp edges beneath it. It stated that Dorothy Harper disputed any claim of wrongdoing and insisted that all financial decisions had been made in Margaret's best interest. It also warned that sudden revocation of authority could create unnecessary instability. I read the letter twice at the kitchen counter while Margaret stood at the sink, staring out at the backyard. The snow had melted into patches of damp earth, and the first signs of early spring were trying to push through the cold ground. She is not going to admit anything, Margaret said quietly without turning around. She does not believe she has done anything wrong. I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. Belief does not change facts, I replied. That afternoon we met again with the attorney. He reviewed the new correspondence and nodded slowly. This may become a civil matter, he explained. Documentation will be important. Every statement. Every withdrawal. Every signed form. Margaret listened carefully, her posture straighter than it had been weeks earlier. She asked questions now. Clear questions. About timelines. About recovery options. About restitution. I watched her as she spoke and realized that something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer asking whether she was allowed to act. She was asking how. After the meeting, we stopped at a small diner off Main Street. The vinyl booths were worn, and the coffee was strong. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me steadily. I used to think control meant safety, she said. If she handled everything, nothing could go wrong. I nodded. Except it did, I said gently. She gave a small, almost rueful smile. Yes. It did. Over the next few days, we gathered paperwork from every source we could. The bank provided detailed transaction histories. The retirement account administrator mailed archived statements. Margaret requested her credit report and studied it carefully at my dining room table. Each document added another layer to the story. Payments. To contractors for home renovations. Transfers to accounts that did not bear Margaret's name. Charges that did not align with the modest lifestyle she had been living. None of it looked dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a quiet pattern. On Thursday evening, my phone rang again. This time it was not my mother. It was a neighbor from Maple Ridge Drive. She spoke cautiously, as if unsure whether she should be involved. I heard Margaret has not been home, she said. Your mother mentioned she was confused lately. I felt the old instinct rise in me to defend, to soften, to explain. Instead, I chose precision. Margaret is well, I said calmly. She is reviewing her finances. There was a brief silence on the other end. Oh, the neighbor replied. I see. After I ended the call, I understood that the narrative was shifting beyond our immediate family. For years, Dorothy had controlled not only the money, but the story. Margaret was fragile. Margaret was forgetful. Margaret needed supervision. Now that version of events was beginning to fracture. That night, Margaret sat across from me with a legal pad in front of her. She wrote slowly, listing dates and memories. Moments when she felt uncertain signing documents. Conversations where she had been told not to worry. Times she asked about her account and was reassured without details. When she finished, she set the pen down carefully. I thought I was being grateful, she said. But I was being silent. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You are not silent anymore, I replied. Outside, the air had softened slightly, and the evening carried the faint scent of thawing soil. Inside my house, the atmosphere felt steady, grounded. The situation was not resolved. The conflict had not disappeared. But the balance had shifted. For the first time in years, Margaret was not waiting for permission. She was participating in her own decisions. And as I watched her organize the papers into neat folders, I realized that this was no longer about confronting our mother alone. It was about rebuilding something that had been quietly eroded over decades. Trust in her own judgment. Confidence in her own voice. The process would take time. There would be more letters. Possibly hearings. Possibly uncomfortable conversations. But the structure that once held her in place had already begun to crack. And cracks, once visible, cannot be unseen. The first official hearing was scheduled on a mild Tuesday morning in early April. The trees along Main Street were beginning to bud, and the air carried that fragile sense of renewal that comes after a long winter. Margaret wore a light gray blazer she had not taken out of her closet in years. She stood in front of my hallway mirror before we left, adjusting the collar with careful hands. "I look different," she said quietly. "You look present," I replied. The courthouse was not large, just a brick building with wide steps and metal railings polished by decades of use. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above us. Margaret walked beside me, not behind. It was a small detail, but I noticed. Dorothy was already seated when we entered the room, her posture straight, her handbag placed neatly at her side. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply observed. For years, that look had been enough to silence questions. Today, it did not. The proceedings were calm, procedural, almost anticlimactic compared to the emotional weight they carried. Documents were reviewed. Statements were summarized. The judge asked Margaret clear questions about her understanding of the authority she had granted and her current wishes. Margaret's voice was steady as she answered. "I did not understand the full extent of what I signed," she said. "I understand it now. I am revoking it." There was no anger in her tone. No accusation. Just clarity. Dorothy's attorney spoke carefully about intentions and family cooperation. But intention does not erase impact. By the end of the session, temporary restrictions were placed on further financial transfers pending review, and Margaret's revocation of power of attorney was formally recognized. It was not dramatic. No raised voices. No spectacle. Just ink on paper and a system acknowledging what had long been invisible. Outside on the courthouse steps, the sunlight felt brighter than it had in months. Margaret paused at the top of the stairs and exhaled slowly. "I kept thinking I would feel guilty," she said. "But I do not." I looked at her profile against the pale blue sky and saw something steady there. "Guilt belongs to choices made in harm," I said quietly. "You are choosing health." That afternoon, we returned to my house and sat at the kitchen table where so much of this journey had unfolded. The folders of documents were stacked neatly in a small box. The legal process would continue. There would be negotiations. Possibly restitution. Possibly mediation. But the essential shift had already happened. Margaret logged into her own account from my laptop, entered her new password without hesitation, and reviewed the updated balance. It was not what it should have been. But it was hers to see. Her phone buzzed once on the table. A message from Dorothy. Just 4 words. "You have chosen sides." Margaret read it and then set the phone down face up instead of turning it over. "I have chosen myself," she said softly. The sentence lingered in the quiet kitchen. I realized then that what began as a desperate knock at my door had become something far larger than a dispute over money. It had exposed the difference between protection and possession. Between loyalty and erasure. Between care and control. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees and shadows stretched across the yard, Margaret stood by the window and watched the light fade. She did not look small anymore. She looked grounded. I understood that families do not fracture in a single moment. They bend slowly, quietly, over years of unchallenged patterns. And sometimes it takes one decision, made without permission, to straighten what has been crooked for decades. I did not know what the final outcome would be. But I knew this much with certainty. When my sister knocked on my door in the middle of the night, she was asking for more than help. She was asking for witness. And this time, neither of us turned away.